Okay, Kindalach. Today's Thursday, it's Vav Tishrei. It's the yard site of the Rebbe's mother. This is the 59th yard site. So I started talking to the other room, to the seminary-based girls, about the Rebbe's mother a little bit. And I'm going to continue that. If anybody wants the previous recording, I'll be very happy to send it to you. What I'm holding is as follows. The Rebbe's parents, for the first 10 years of their marriage, lived in Nikolaev. During those 10 years, the Rebbe's father didn't work. He sat and learned and davened. All three of the boys were born in Nikolaev. The Rebbe was 7 when he left Nikolaev. He had good recollections. And they probably were very, very beautiful years. I can imagine. They were beautiful, beautiful years. Then, when the Rebbe's father was around 30, 31, the Rebbetzin Chana was probably 29, the Rebbe Rashab did him a favor. And I mean that very sarcastically. And he got him a job. So he could be a paid employee. He's not living on the dole. But the job he got him was the Rabbanus of one of the most difficult communities any place in Russia. Very dynamic, very diverse, very competitive, very political. And the Rebbe's parents really showed themselves fit for the task. The Rebbe's parents both had human skills that were extraordinary. People hated their beliefs deeply, but loved them. And people would say they kept the Rebbe's father alive. You know, many Rabbanim went to jail a lot before 1939. How come the Rebbe's father wasn't arrested until 1939? I'm sure there's more than one reason. Reason number one, because he was too prominent a person to put in jail, it would be too much noise. But reason number two is because the agents of the KGB who were supposed to arrest him would come in the afternoon and tell the Rebbetzin Chana, tonight Levik shouldn't sleep at home. So they came to arrest him, he was away. Now it just worked out that every time they came to arrest him, Punk that day he was away, because the same guy who was coming at night to arrest would come in the afternoon and let them know he's coming tonight, you understand? This was the kind of love-hate relationship that Rebbe's parents had. They were remarkable.
The KGB would say to them that,
not the whole KGB, one guy, Yiddish Chevra man, would show up and say, he wouldn't say we're coming to arrest you, he'd say, Heindel Levik nicht schlafen in der Ring. Today Levik shouldn't sleep at home. So he didn't. It happened, I think it happened more than once. I think it's true. I mean, these are things that I heard. Again, I said I never met a woman, but that's what they say. The Rebbe's brothers grew up in Yekaterinslav, in Yekaterinslav, in Petrovsk. I guess by the time the Rebbe was 18 or 20, probably 20, the Soviet Union's grip and terror reached Yekaterinslav. Yekaterinslav is the very bottom of Russia. It's the Ukraine. The revolution started in the north, in Leningrad, Petersburg. So it took a while for the civil war to be fought out, and to be many Yidden were killed during that civil war. Unbelievable numbers. And then the Rabbanus changed. It didn't become a Rabbanus of shepherding this big, beautiful community. It became a Rabbanus of Pashat, helping people physically and spiritually, and holding on to an ember, you know. Once the revolution came, the Freie Yidden were not so frei anymore. They were practically frei, but their hatred for Yiddishkeit, unless they were diehard communists, the whole dynamic was different. And the Rebbe's parents spent 20 years, or whatever number of years it was, under the Bolsheviks, until the Rebbe's father, Reb Levik, was arrested in 1939, right before Pesach. Pashat helping people. There's a Ribui Maisis. There's many, many stories. Pashat personal stories. One of the stories which is rather interesting is that there was a man whose name was Kesse. I forgot his first name. This guy Kesse would be a member of parliament in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament in the 60s and the 70s. This Mr. Kesse lost both of his parents, either from the war or for pogroms or from hunger. He was a teenager, he was 14 years old, he had no parents. He was a Zionist, he wasn't from, he was a Zionist. He wanted to get to Israel, but he was having a hard time getting out of the country. He came to Yekaterinslav, I'm assuming because it was a big city, and the Rebbe's parents adopted him. The guy lived in their house. When the Rebbe was Rebbe, he was very friendly to Lubavitch always, he was very supportive of Chabadnikim. He would go into the Rebbe Tichedus and they would talk like brothers. He lived in the house, I think, for 2 years, until he was able to find a way of sneaking out of Russia and getting to Israel. They did an interview with his wife. He passed away a long time, and his wife said, my husband regained his belief in humanity in the Schneerson's home. If you lose your parents when you're 14 years old, you got a pretty negative perspective on life. The Rebbe's parents gave him back optimism. They made him look at the world as positive because they were so kind to him. That's just one story. And there are hundreds of stories like that where they helped people. You know, sometimes it was gashmias, food, a job, a place to sleep, a place to hide. And very often it was ruchnias. If someone wanted to make a bris or a chasana, there are interviews with Russian men and women who knew the Rebbe's parents as children and as young people in Yekaterinslav, and they were interviewed by Jem. If you watch Jem, you've seen these videos. A woman said she was a girl, and she was probably from in Russia. I don't think she was particularly from here in America, but she remembers the Rebbe's mother's home. Her office was the kitchen. All the women who were in the close-knit circle would gather in the kitchen every day or from time to time, and they talked about people. Not gossip. So-and-so needs this, so-and-so needs this, and so-and-so lost this, and so-and-so lost that. And they would sit and strategize how kosher to help people. If someone wanted to learn to make a kosher chasana or a bris or a mitzvah or a havla levaya, and these people watched the Rebbetzin Chana and the Reb Levik shepherd a community during very, very difficult years and do everything in their power possible to help people. Pashat, everything in their power possible to help people. One of the, I guess you would call the bittersweet moments of their life, of the Rebbe's parents, we're talking about the Rebbe's mother, right? This is not a class about the Rebbe, it's about the Rebbe's mother, is the fact that their sons left Russia. The Rebbe left Russia to get married. The Rebbe left Russia because he was meant to be the son of the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Frierdiker was forced to leave Russia, he had to leave Russia. And the Rebbe left Russia together with the Frierdiker Rebbe. There is a shmua, there is a rumor, and by the way, Mr. Rumor can say whatever he wants and he gets away with it, but Mr. Rumor spread a rumor saying that the Rebbe once told his mother, the Rebbe once said to his mother, I will never forgive myself for leaving the country and leaving you alone by yourselves. The Rebbe, who was separated from his parents for about 18 years, he never saw his father again. His father passed away in 1944. He did see his mother in 1947, and he couldn't do it. He couldn't do enough for her. He would go into her twice a day when he was in France. He would go in every single day. Even after the Rebbe was Rebbe, he never missed going to see his mother. He couldn't make up for the time that he was not able to mechabed Abba v'imei. He ate him up alive. So the boys left. The Rebbe left, and then a couple of years after that, Leib left. The younger brother, Yisrael Leib, also left. And that must have been very, very hard for them. Yisrael Leib moved to Yisrael, and he lived in Yisrael almost till the end of his life. The last couple of years he moved to England, and he passed away in England, as we know. And then he was buried in Tzfas. The Rebbe made final arrangements for the Rebbe's brother. He was buried in Tzfas. There was a middle son whose name was Berel, who unfortunately suffered some kind of a mental breakdown. I don't know the details of it. And he was in a home. He was in a sanitarium, what we would call in America a long-term facility. And there's documents which have not been published where the Rebbe's parents had an opportunity to leave Russia. Rabbi Castell always tells me he was supposed to be the Rabbi Rashi of Boston. He's a Bostonian, so he always said. The Rebbe's father was offered the Rabbanus of Boston, and there was a possibility that the Soviet Union would let him leave because he was being offered a job outside the country. So he wasn't just leaving to run away, he was going to another job. And they applied to leave. And they never acted on it. So when they arrested him in 1939, they asked him many questions. One of the questions they asked the Rebbe's father was, you made all these plans to leave the country, you were planning to move to America, why didn't you move? And the first to them it was because you wanted to undermine the government. And the Rebbe's father said, because they would not take our son, and we were not going to leave him behind. That was the answer. The Rebbe's parents could have left Russia, but America was not going to take Berel, and they were not going to leave behind, so they stayed in the Soviet Union, and ultimately the Rebbe's father, Reb Levik, paid with his life. So the departure of the boys must have been very painful to them. Very, very, very painful. Chachafilu, having your son married to the Frierdiker Rebbe's daughter, was an unbelievable covenant. And the Reb Levik used to boast, Ich bin the Edim, ich bin the Mechutten, I'm the Mechutten from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and then he would say a little bit in spite, a little bit to shtech the Lubavitchers. And I'm the father of the next Rebbe. And when you would say that, they wanted to kill him. That's like the worst thing you say. Every Rebbe lives forever, every Rebbe is Mashiach, but the Rebbe Levik, and I'm the father of the next Rebbe. There's evidence that the Rebbe's father made that a condition of the marriage that the Frierdiker Rebbe agreed that the Rebbe would be the next Rebbe. I don't want to talk about that story at the moment. But what I do want to describe to you is the wedding. The Rebbe's wedding was delayed about a year. Frierdiker Rebbe left Russia after Simchas Teda.
How old was the Rebbe when he got
The Rebbe was 26 and a half. And the Rebbetzin Chaim Mushka was 27 and a half. The Rebbe's birthday is in Nisan, her birthday is the end of Adar. They're a year and 15 days apart. The Rebbetzin is 1 year and 15 days older than the Rebbe, something like that.
younger?
Older. The Rebbetzin is older than the Rebbe.
Oh, no, the Rebbetzin was older.
The Rebbetzin Chaim Mushka is older than the Rebbe. One of the reasons the Chasna was delayed because there was no money to pay for the wedding. Another reason the Chasna was delayed was because there was a hope that the Rebbe's parents would be allowed to attend. In other words, be given a visitation, permission to leave Russia for a few weeks, come to the wedding and go back. And there was a lot of negotiating with the government of Russia to allow the Rebbe's parents just to leave for a while. And the visa was denied and denied and denied. Once it was clear that they're not getting the visa, they set the date for the wedding, and the Rebbe got married in Poland. The Rebbe was living, Frierdiker was living in Riga, Latvia, but the Rebbe's chasna took place in Varsha, which was like the biggest, it was the metropolis. It was the city of Jews in Poland. And that's what the Rebbe's chasna was. The Rebbe's chasna was a grand affair. It was attended by all the big daily Yisrael in Poland at the time, and so on and so forth. The Rebbe's parents missed the wedding. So there's very poignant letters from the Rebbe's father to the Rebbe. One of the sweetest letters is, take this amount of money, buy your kala, a beautiful piece of jewelry, and we'll reimburse you, and she should use it so gesundheit. It's a letter from the Rebbe's father to buy your kala for us. A substantial amount of money, a beautiful piece of jewelry. When he says getragen gesundheit, the Rebbe's father was a very warm man. His writing is Pashat Mushi, the Rebbe's father. It's a big he writes to his son with so much warmth and so much love. There's a letter from him to the Rebbetzin Chaim Mushka, where he says to, please don't write to me like a daughter-in-law. Write to me like a loved daughter, the Rebbe's father. They missed the wedding. So what they did was, they made a wedding without a chas and kala. Now I told the other group, I don't know if I told it to you, that when the Soviets took over the country, the Rebbe's parents were given a very large apartment. They had a very, very huge apartment. They had like 6 rooms. When the revolution happened, they cut their apartment in half. When they made the chasana, the neighbors, I don't even think they were Jews. They loved the Rebbe's parents so much, they cleared out of the apartment completely and opened up the doors that separated the apartment into 2. And the Rebbe's parents had room in their apartment to host several hundred guests. And they made a wedding in their apartment, minus a chas and kala. And the simcha was unbelievable. It was a huge event. And the Rebbe's father said Torah, and they danced, and they sang. There was a men's room, and there was a women's room. And the chasana was a grand affair. They just were missing the chasna and the kala. One of the sweetest things that we know from that chasana was, there was an old Russian man who was interviewed by Jem, who was a kid. And he says that the day after the wedding that they made for the adults, the Rebbe's parents invited all the children to the house to make a wedding for the kids. I don't know how many children, I'm sure there were many children in Yekaterinslav, but I don't know how many children wanted to associate with the Rav in 1929 in the Soviet Union, but a number of kids came. And they sat by the table, and the Rebbetzin Chaim Mushka, the Rebbetzin Chana, verbringt with them. And what he said was that she said, I think the Rebbe's father also sat with them, that everybody has a talent. Everybody is good in one thing. So everybody should perform in what they're good at. This one should sing, and this one should dance, and this one should draw. And this man said, I said, I'll sing. He's an old man when he's being interviewed, but he's describing what happened as a child. And he says that the Rebbe's mother was so musical that her body was a language of music. Everything about it, she was incredibly musical. She sang so beautifully. He knew her as a child. And he sang for her, and she sang with him, and he describes how incredibly musical she was, the Rebbe's mother. So this is another little story. And like I said before, there's many, many stories, most of whom we'll probably never know, about during all those years, during the Soviet years, the Rebbe's parents fought for Yiddishkeit, and Poshet helped people. Poshet helped people. The big fight that Reb Levik fought, as we know, the Rebbe spoke about it many times, was the fight for kosher and matzah. B'derech hatev, that's what cost him his life. Every year he wanted matzah, and the government said, sure, make matzah, but the flour was bleached, which meant the flour was chometz gomer. And Reb Levik would fight to get flour which was not bleached. And one year they gave him flour that wasn't bleached, and it was delivered in a car that had a hole, and it rained. So he wanted another batch of flour, and now the government had enough. You need flour, gave you flour. You didn't like the batch, you want again? He went till Kalinin. Kalinin was the president of the Soviet Union, not the prime minister. The prime minister was Stalin in Mashmei. Kalinin was a good Meshuggah, he was a goy. But he was not at all a Saint Yisrael. He helped a lot of Yidden in a lot of ways. He was just a funny man. And the Rebbe's father met Kalinin and said, you have to, and he wrote a letter that when it comes to the matzah, Rabbi Schneerson and his mashgichim have carte blanche, you got to provide it. And they punished him for it. He was arrested Tes Nisan, a week before Pesach. And B'derech HaTeva, his arrest had to do with the fact that he fought for matzah. The Rebbe's father lasted as long as he did because he had friends in high places. They were going to come to arrest him, and some guy would knock on his door and say, tonight don't sleep at home, and that's how they lasted till 1939. Most of his contemporaries were arrested much before that. And then, of course, there's the stories of the KGB agents coming in the middle of the night to do a bris, They were hidden, but they were never reingeschafft in this whole Magefa. But they still wanted to do something Jewish, and they would come in the middle of the night to make a chasana. And these things, and this is what the Rebbe's parents did. They helped push it to a lot of people. There's a letter from the Rebbe, which is very compelling, from our Rebbe, which is now printed in this Krach Tetzvav, the Fidik Rebbe's Kaddish, where the Rebbe writes the Fidik Rebbe, it's the early 30s, maybe 33. The Rebbe writes the Fidik Rebbe, Kfei Gdush Mevacham Yad Moshlita. I feel terrible to give the Rebbe, he's talking about his own father-in-law, Agmas Nefesh, but I have no choice. And he proceeds to describe that his parents were in a very, very dangerous situation at that point. And he says to the Fidik Rebbe, I made it Ahmed for my father. And Lepoil, he was not arrested at that point. But the Rebbe writes a letter, it's printed in Igris. You could see the letter where he's writing to the Fidik Rebbe, I hate to be the bearer of bad news. I need your help. You need to be mispal, that they should not suffer whatever ills it was. And at that time, it passed. This probably was 1932 or 33 when that letter was written. He was arrested in 39. All the years the Rebbe was living in Germany, and then of course in France, the Rebbe would send them money, the Rebbe would send them boots. There's a letter from the Rebbe's father. This is the Rebbe's father for you. He writes a letter addressed to the Rebbe and maybe to the Rebbetzin, giving them a hello, how are you? 2 or 3 lines of regular small talk. And then he writes, I got the shoes, parenthesis, 20 pages of Kabbalah explaining what shoes mean, end the parenthesis, and they fit, and he signs his name. This is Reb Levik. But the Rebbe Pashat helped them as much as he was able to. The Rebbe's father was arrested right before Pesach, and of course the story was that he spent about 5 months in prisons. He was in 6 prisons, but he was in the same prison twice. He has a whole explanation of Kabbalah. The Rebbe's father had that yeshiva called Ani Lev Yitzchak Ben Zelda, where he describes his arrest and Al-Pi Kabbalah explaining everything that happened to him. The Rebbe spoke about it once in the Fabrengen, and he was in prison for about 5 months. After that he was tried and he was sentenced to 5 years of exile, which was retroactive. So the 5 years started when they arrested him right before Pesach, and they ended 5 years later, 1944, also right before Pesach. The Rebbe's mother, Rebbetzin Chana, was frantic. She was beside her. When they arrested her husband, the biggest problem was nobody would tell her where they took him. In Russia, everything is a secret just because. And there was a cruelty element, You took my husband, put him in jail. Can you tell me where he is? I don't know. It's not my department, and no one knows. She knew that her husband is going to starve Pesach. He will eat nothing, maybe not even drink the water. And she was pashat, worried of his life. And she ran around from jail to jail, from office to office. She deposited a few pounds of matzah. We don't know whether Reb Levik got it now, but she knew that the Rebbe's father will eat nothing for 8 days. And she ran around crazy to try and find him some place where he was, to send him some matzah, and she'd have what to eat for Pesach. And then, of course, she took care of him while he was in jail. And later, when he was fashikt, when they sent him away to Chile, I don't know how you pronounce that word, Chiloy. I mean, I met a Jew who knows how you pronounce that word. It was a small city in Asia which had more mosquitoes than molecules of oxygen. It was incredibly unpleasant. And they lived like in a porch of somebody's house, and their accommodations were terrible. And they lived there for 5 years, the Rebbe's parents. She immediately made whatever arrangements she needed to make. She closed up her house, she left it behind for other people to look after, and she went to join her husband. The fact was that saved her life, because had they been in Yekaterinslav when the Russians came in, they killed all the Jews. The Rebbe's parents were not there. But the apartment that they had occupied, which was full of svarim and full of notebooks of Reb Levik's Kisvei Yad, people used it at some point, push it for firewood. They were freezing. The cold winters, there was no wood, they used the push it for firewood. This is the shmua. It's hard to know what happened to all the ksavim. Some of them are alive, some of them are extant. Most of what the Rebbe's father owned and what the Rebbe's father wrote is, at least to this day, lost to us. The Rebbe's brother, Berel, remained behind in Yekaterinslav. And the Nazis killed him. The Rebbe's brother was killed by the Nazis. Bepashtus, the Rebbe's brother was killed by the Nazis. She joined her husband. And it's a gewaltige Meise, it's a schöne Meise. There's a mishpacha in Lubavitch called Kaplan. They're a very prominent mishpacha. They're originally Litvische. Their Zayde was the Rav of Kiev. Was a very, very big gon. Was a gewaltige Talmud Chacham. We would call it Remes Nagid, but he was a very Erlich Yid. He was arrested at the same time as the Rebbe's father, also in Ukraine. And he was aware of what's going on with Reb Levik. And he was also sent to 5 years of exile, but not to Chile, to a different city. And he was more down to earth. He was resourceful. He knew how to take care of himself. And he knew that Reb Levik is not going to know what to do for bread. So as a prisoner, he was not allowed to leave the city. He would sneak onto a train and he would travel to Chile. He would get off the train. He'd go to the place where Levik was living alone, and he would cook him kugel and chalt. Cook him Jewish foods, you know. When the Rebbe's mother arrived, she sees kugel. And she knew that her husband made that kugel, and there wasn't a Jew around for miles. She says, where'd you get the kugel from? So Levik says, Elyana v'kumt yadavach. Elyana comes every week and he makes me kugel and shakich. Anyway, a few days later, she sees a yid with a beard coming to the house. She runs to the Levik, cooked a yid tabad. That's Elyana Navi. That's Elyana Navi. So when Nachum Kaplan, somebody story himself, when they came to America, the Rebbetzin said to her father, Label, die Gehesen gedenk ich nicht. Ich kenn doch Tayum sein dem Taten's kugel, I can still taste your father's kugel. I'm sure he wasn't a big cook, but he was better than a Levik. I just heard the story, so I'm sharing the story with you. And the conditions were very hard. The food was hard, and the loneliness was terrible. And Reb Levik suffered terribly. Not so much physically, but as morally. They broke him. They destroyed him. Reb Levik was a gibber. He was a shneis. He was strong as a lion. That a man of his strength to pass away at 66 was a consequence of abuse. It wasn't natural. It wasn't natural. His body was broken down by tzaras. Physical tzaras and psychological tzaras. And of course, the story of stories that we know, it's really a remarkable story. The Rebbe's mother did everything in her power. She respected the Rebbe's father and she loved him. Believable, her whole world was the Rebbe's father. When the Rebbe's father passed away, her life was over. She was so fortunate to be married to him, and she so much missed him. But she did everything in her power to make his life a little bit easier. And of course, the famous story was that the man had no paper, and no pen, and had no ink. So she went to the field and she collected sedges, grasses. I don't know how you do this, but she was a very brilliant lady. She figured out how to make ink from whatever she was able to find. I want you to know that if you've ever gone to the Rebbe's library, they have displays. You could see the original Sfarim. The Rebbe's father is writing in fluorescent pink. You understand? How many rabbis write in fluorescent pink and in and in sky? Whatever color flowers she found, she would collect them. I don't know how you make ink out of flowers. She would cook them and cook them and cook them and cook them and cook them, and she would produce dense enough ink, and the Rebbe's father would use a feather and write. And he wrote on the margins of the few Sfarim that he had. He had a Mishnayos, and he had a Tanya, and he had a Zohar, and I think that's it. She kept those few books with her, and she left Russia with them. And the whole time she had one concern, that the letters shouldn't fade before she gets to her son. Once the Rebbe would get them, then he'll take care of it already, he'll remember it if need be. But she was very, very afraid that the ink, she made ink herself, but she wasn't a professional ink maker, you understand? She was sort of, but the ink survived. The ink it's over 80 years. You could read the writings of Reb Levik on the sun. They put it on display, I've seen it. It's fascinating, it's very, very interesting. And she provided the Rebbe, his father, with able to write a little bit. Because he had no paper, he had to write very bekitzer. And the Rebbe spent 20 years explaining the status of his father on the fact that he wrote so briefly because he didn't have any paper. Now he was held for 5 years. In 1944, before Pesach, his sentence was over, which meant he was allowed to leave. But it was in the middle of the Second World War. But you're talking now April 44. The Russians were really winning at that point. They were pushing the Germans back, pushing the Germans back, pushing the Germans back. But Russia, in its wonderful style of being as kind and as nice as many of its citizens as possible, had a policy that said that until the war is over, nobody could move. No one could budge. Even if you were a prisoner and your sentence was over or commuted, you had to stay in your place till the war was over. The Lubavitcher Chassidim living in Almaty, which was the closest community of Jews to where their parents were aware of how difficult it was for them with Pashatas and Konos Nefashis. And they risked their own lives. They were Moisa Nefesh. They gave a bribe to illegally move them from Chile, or however you pronounce that word, to Yekaterinslav, to Almaty, where the Rebbe's parents came before Pesach. When they arrived in Almaty, there was a kehil of people, a Jewish community, and they did everything in their power to make the Rebbe's parents honored and comfortable and provided for whatever they needed. They came up for Pesach, and the Rebbe's father's body was racked with cancer. He was very sick. A doctor examined him, and the doctor put him on a liquid diet to keep him alive as long as possible. They had no cure. You're talking 80 years ago, they had no cure. He was very sick. And the doctor sees matzah and moder and karpas and chareres and charoises and wine. And he says to Reb Levik, you're not eating any of that. So Reb Levik says to him, that's not food, that's not food, that's not food, that's mitzvahs. You're not going to stop Reb Levik from eating matzah. And he lived...
Reb Levik got that sick because of what he went through?
For sure. His body was emotionally taxed. People say that you can't explain cancer. You can't. Nobody knows why some people get it, some people don't get it. But b'chalal, there are many illnesses that are physical illnesses that are psychosomatic. If you have more stress, you're more likely to get an ulcer, right? A stomach doctor told me, there's no scientific evidence there's any relation between stress and an ulcer. And then he says, but relax, you're going to get an ulcer. I said, I don't understand. You told me there's no scientific. He says, no scientific relationship, but everybody knows that you have a stress, you get an ulcer. And the same is true. The body is taxed. The body weakens, and it weakens, it's attacked. The Rebbe's parents lived there for 5 months, and there's some wonderful stories about that time. The Chassidim were very kind to them, and they did whatever they could to help them. The Rebbe's father went to shul. There's a famous story, Shavuos. The Rebbe gathered the kids together, the Rebbe's father, and he spoke to the children the way the Rebbe would speak to the children. That they're the future, and they're the next generation, and they shouldn't be afraid, and they should be yidden, and so on and so forth. The Rebbe's father was once crying, and the Rebbe's mother said to him, "Vavos weinst du?" And he said, ich wein nicht, weil ich gehe weg, ich wein, weil ich gehe weg, und ich los dir ibe da allein. I'm not crying because I'm passing away. I'm crying because I'm going away and leaving you here alone. One of the most amazing stories I know about the Rebbe's mother, and I read it years ago in a magazine called Beis Chayenu. A woman named Altois was a teenager in Almaty during the war. Now you have to understand, during the Second World War, death was breakfast. People were dying everywhere. I mean, today when there's a tragedy, someone dies, everyone goes crazy. Yeah? People were dying all the time. Death was normal. Today people got sick, people died. You started 1, 2, 3. And there was so much death, and there was so much trouble, and there was so much suffering. Everybody was just worn out. And the Rebbe's father passes away, and everybody came to the house. Everybody just ran to the house. The little apartment that everybody came to beat with them, with her. There's a Yid who describes how when Reb Levik passed away, some guy called him and said, take your bicycle, go to all the neighbors in town and tell them that Reb Levik passed away, there's going to be a Levai, they should come to the Levai. So this girl, whose name is Altair, I think her name was Miriam, walked into the Rebbe's parents' apartment and started to wail. She screamed. And I'm sure that wailing, that crying wasn't just Reb Levik, it was everything, you know. And the Rebbe's mother turned to her at that moment, it was before her husband's Levaya, and said to her, Bei Yidden schreit man nicht. Jews don't scream. That's how much presence this woman had. Bei Yidden schreit man nicht. Jews don't scream. After the Rebbe's father passed away, there's a famous story. There was a Yid named Nimoitin, Yossel Nimoitin, who I met once. He lived here in Crown Heights on Brooklyn Avenue. He walked by the house and the Rebbe's mother was crying. And he said, why an interview? I was weinst. She said, why am I crying? My husband, I'm all myself. So we asked her, do you have any relatives in Moscow? People that you know in Moscow. Moscow was closer to the center, was closer to the west, And she said, yeah, she had some kind of relative in Moscow. He says, okay, I'll get you to Moscow. We'll get you out of the country. So the story was, I heard this from relatives of the Nemoitins, that there was a family of 4 who wanted to travel to Moscow and they needed airplane tickets in the middle of the Second World War, which meant you needed major, major connections and major, major bribes. Yossel Nemoitin had both. And they came to him and said, you would do us a favor and get us tickets on an airplane, we want to fly to Moscow, which was unheard of in those days. And Yossel said, sure, I'll make you all the arrangements, but there's one thing, you're taking a 5th person with you, you're taking a Rebbetzin Chana. And they said, no. She was a marked woman, she was the husband of a Rav. And Yossel said, you're not taking her, there are no tickets, you understand? So they took her, and they brought her to Moscow, and she spent, I don't know how long in Moscow, probably a year or 2. And of course, Mumas Sada, the famous Mumas Sada, who was she was the leader of the group of the Chassidim who got Anash out of Russia in 1946. You heard the names of Mendel Futterfass, Leibel Mochkin, Yena Paltavid, a few others who were Meisa Nefesh. They got 1,300, 4,000 Chassidim out of Russia using Pelish Papirin. They convinced the Rebbe's mother to leave. The Rebbe's mother was afraid. She wanted to leave legally, with the claim that her husband had died, the children were out of the country, and they told her, you're never getting out. With a name like Shnes, never getting out of the country. They wore her down, and she agreed to leave a false paper, and she did. And she traveled carrying her husband's most precious possessions. The ksavim. She had a gadol, I think, from the Tzemach Tzedek, which the Rebbe would later wear. She had a shofar from the Rebbe Marash, which the Rebbe would later use. All kinds of very precious things that came from the Mishpachas Beis Harav, from the Rebbe's Mishpacha. The Rebbe's father was a cousin. And she carried them with her out of Russia. When she was leaving the country, Bel Yunik was a young bocher and he was helping her, and nobody else was helping her. No, everyone was very busy. And she said to him, be careful, because in this chimedan, in this valise that you're carrying, there are Kodesh Kadoshim, the holiest of holiest artifacts that belong to Rabbi Nesienu. So some chassid overheard it and he wanted to run and carry the valise himself. And she says, no, if you weren't going to help me till now, don't help me right there. He can do it for just fine. She left Russia with everybody and she ended up in Pucking in Germany. And she was by herself. She was also quite ill. And there were certain people who looked after. Certain people realized how lonely she was. They looked after her. She had a minik. She would go every month to Shabbos Tavila. She would go into the Nissen Nemenah. The Nissen was a big chassid, a very big chassid. And they had these barracks. They lived in these barracks, like bunks, camp bunks that had been used by the Nazis for who knows what. It was in Germany, the Pucking, the refugee camps, displaced persons camps. And people helped her. One of the women helped her, a lady named Mrs. Ushbal, Rebbetzin Ushbal. She pushed physically. She would wash her, push it. In any case, she was very ill. Years and years later, when Mrs. Ushbal came to America, she came to see the Rebbe's mother. And the Rebbe's mother was so appreciative of what she had done for her. So she said to her son told me this, that when she came into the Rebbe's Chana, she referred to her as Tochter, my daughter. She was incredibly appreciative of how she had helped her in those difficult times. And she says to her, I want you to do me a favor. I want you to come back at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. I want you to meet my son. So she told people that the Rebbetzin Chana told her to come back at 6 o'clock after, said it's impossible. 6 o'clock, the Rebbe comes to see his mother, and there's never anybody in the house. She told him to come at 6. Anyway, so she came. And she walked in, the Rebbe was already sitting there. And the Rebbetzin Chana introduced her to the Rebbe. And she said, this is the Rebbetzin. Her son told me, Zalman told me that when the Rebbetzin Chana talked to her alone, he called her my daughter. When he introduced her to the Rebbe, he called her a Rebbetzin. She was then called Mrs. Chaikin. She was married 3 times. Schmuckler, Chaikin, Ushpa. She was an incredible lady, Mrs. Ushpa. But she helped the Rebbetzin, and the Rebbetzin never forgot it. He was Makateva. She was Makateva. And of course, they made arrangements for the Rebbetzin to come to Paris and to apply to a visa and enter the United States. Our Rebbe never left New York, as you know. From the time the Rebbe arrived in New York, he never left. Except once. The Rebbe left the state of New York one time by the Frierdiker Rebbe's encouragement. He spent 3 months in Paris retrieving his mother. Now, why does it take 3 months to pick up your mother? You go, you put her on a plane, you take her home. There's a number of reasons. Number one, they needed a visa, they needed permission to enter into the country. Number two, apparently the Rebbe's mother was in poor health. Some people say she even had tuberculosis, which would have meant that America would never let her into the country. And they had to do whatever shtickis things to get by the American inspections that she was able to come into the country. And they wanted to fatten her up, to make her look like a healthy person, that she's not going to be, quote, a burden on America. She was an elderly lady. So the Rebbe spent 3 months in France. He stayed in a hotel. She stayed by Zalman Schneerson. Zalman Schneerson was a first cousin of Reb Levik, a first cousin of the Rebbe's father. Zalman Schneerson was a first cousin. Zalman Schneerson's father and Reb Levik's father were brothers. And she stayed in their house. There's descriptions of the first time the Rebbe met her, how emotional it was. And when she was in France, the Rebbe would go see his mother twice every day. Twice a day, he would walk from his hotel to see her. During the 3 months that the Rebbe was in France, the Rebbe did all kinds of things on behalf of the Frierdiker Rebbe. He met Lubavitcher Chassidim. He probably even scouted out his first shluchim, Michal Lipsker, the Rebbe met in France. And then 2 years later, he sent him to Morocco. And he met Anash, and he encouraged Anash to connect with the Frierdiker Rebbe. And there's a whole new Lubavitch now. You know, Lubavitch changed from being Chabad and insular to Afatzlayonis, Fatzayadus. And Lubavitchers coming from Russia didn't know any of this. The Rebbe had to teach them all of this. And the Rebbe brought his mother to New York. I just want to say this to you. Rabbi said, Yom Kippur is 26 hours. Rosh Hashanah is 2 days. 26 hours to be high is possible. In Halacha, it's called Yom Kippur. The Pnimis of Yom Kippur is called Yom HaKodesh. The custom by Yid Yom Kippur is if you could, you don't sleep at all. 1 day. You want Yom Kippur, it's a day of tshuva, but the Pnimis of Yom Kippur, it's a day of holiness. You remove yourself from everything, and you just be holy for 1 day. Mekenes bavais. You can have a mitzvah as success Yom Kippur. I bless you all to have a meaningful Yom Kippur. Chas v'shalom, you should hate it. Shav Yisrael tshuva mitis, and we should all be good Jews. And I'll see you in mitzvah.